Erev Tov, everybody. Rav Meidan has two essays in this volume on Ruvain's sin with Bilhah, and in the English that I sent you seems to be a kind of combination of the two with some variations. So if you looked at the English, what we're going to see in the Hebrew overlaps significantly with the second half of that, but is not identical. And I don't know the order of things kind of how Rav Meidan was thinking this through. Hold on a second, just checking my internet connection. It hopped to my upstairs neighbors, so hold on a moment. I'm going to switch to our network, and if I lose you, I'll pop right back. Pair of essays, the second one of which we're going to see, in particular, this second essay is a feature of Rav Meidan that I particularly enjoy, kind of his modern midrash approach, where he says, let's sort of resort to our imagination and take the different pieces of the puzzle, fill in the gaps, and try to construct a story. And he's doing that to try to deal with, as we always say, even if we disagree with his answer, the questions are always questions we need to consider. And so his really focal questions are, how does one square the plain sense of the text, which says that Ruvain lay with Bilhah, and this rabbinic approach, which looks to go against the text and minimize to some other more minimal approach, that it was not actually a sexual cohabitation of any kind, but something much more minor. And what would that be? And of course, he points out that the rabbis, the sages, are on good grounds to potentially suggest a more minimalist interpretation of this verse, because if it was really true that Ruvain had slept with Bilhah, how could it be that he would really still be kind of counted amongst the 12 tribes and given a portion? Wouldn't he really kind of forfeit his place with such a severe misdeed? And Yaakov critiques him in the end of his life, but not at the level that one would expect for such a severe sin. So the text itself feels inconsistent at some level. There are different midrashic approaches. Rav Meidan is going to try to make sense of it all together as much as he can. And I'm going to find the psukim. Okay, just as a starting point, since Rav Meidan only quotes the psukim at the beginning of the first of his two essays, and we're looking at the second, I'll share my screen so we can see the psukim, and then we'll start into the essay. This is in the chapter that follows the rape of Dinah. Yaakov is continuing on his travels. He's in Beit El, names Beit El, renames Beit El, builds his monument there. Binyamin is born, Rachel dies, and Yaakov sets up a monument to her. We did one or two of those essays in previous times. Vayisa Yisrael vayet aholo mehala lemigdal eder. Yaakov Yisrael continued on and pitched his tent. He has gotten his name changed now, not just from the Ish, but from God. He's called Yisrael, although the name moves back and forth. Pitches his tent beyond Migdal Eder. By the way, the question of sort of Yaakov's tent is very central to the story. Vahi bishkon Yisrael ba'aretz hahi, while Yisrael was dwelling in that land. Vayelech Ruvain. Ruvain went, Vayishkav et Bilhah pilegesh aviv, and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. Vayishma Yisrael. Yisrael found out. Now, the kind of different ordering and different components of this verse are important. So we've sort of really got three sections: the setting of the scene and the action itself. Yisrael was dwelling in that land, and Ruvain went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. That's part one. 2, Vayishma Yisrael. Yisrael heard, seeming to be found out about it. And then 3, and there's this very unusual Masoretic feature of a piska be'emtza pasuk. The line in the Torah goes empty till the end at the midpoint or grammatical midpoint of the sentence. Then the next line continues while it's still the same verse. Vayuvnei Yaakov shnei masar, and Yaakov's sons were 12 in number. Okay, so we got these 3 components: the story of Reuven lying with Bilhah, his father's concubine. Israel hears, and the children of Yaakov are 12. That's our backdrop. Anybody who said that Reuven sins, claims that Reuven sinned, is nothing but mistaken. This is a declaration in the Gemara in Shabbat that we're going to see just a few lines down from here. Okay, beginning with Aleph Pticha, the introduction, the opening. In our previous essay, we opened with this major question about the understanding of Reuven's action according to the Pshat. How could it be that we could interpret this according to its plain sense, that he actually slept with Bilhah? As we explained, Bereshit deals with choosing and deflecting within the families of the fathers of the nation. Yishmael and Esav are rejected, pushed aside, whereas the children of Yaakov are all chosen to be the nation of God. If Reuven really behaved like Avshalom, the son of David, in sleeping with his father's wife, a concubine wife, but sleeping with his father's wife, how could it be that he would not have been pushed off, rejected from being amongst the founders of the nation of God, of Am Yisrael? How can we understand the relatively forgiving approach of Yaakov to Reuven at the end of his life, and in Vayechi, when Yaakov certainly is critical of Reuven's behavior, but in the context of the deathbed charge where all the sons are inheritors and continuers of the line? How can we understand the relatively forgiving approach of Yaakov to Reuven on his last day, in light of or as against, for example, the punishment of Shimon and Levi with a much stricter punishment, which is almost seems like a rejection at the deathbed speech, and yet how does their sin compare is the implicit question. As we saw in the previous essay, various Tanaim, Mishnaic period sages, and other commentaries understood the sin and its plain sense that Reuven slept with Bilhah. Together with this, the questions that we are raising, the heavy questions, the questions we are raising are heavy and ground the position that the sin that was mentioned shouldn't be understood according to its plain sense. Rather, one should explain it in a different way. And in fact, this approach was taken by a number of our sages. So again, he spent more time on that in the previous essay, but we're taking him at his word and at his minimal argument that if this were literal, Reuven would certainly have had to get at least as severe a criticism as Shimon and Levi, if not an outright rejection from being a part of the tribes of Yaakov and the continuity of Bnei Israel. Again, it's an interesting assumption. It seems so clear that the kind of idea of Yaakov is that all the children inherit and continue the line, and that's what's different from the previous generations, even if they're imperfect or sinners. But here he wants to maintain the possibility that it has to be the case that if you behave badly enough, even if you're a child of Yaakov, that you would be excluded from the family line. So that's a lot of what pushes him to assume that it can't really be that he slept with Bilhah. And while it is the case that some interpret that way, let's look at the ones who didn't. And so he quotes the Gemara in Shabbat, which says, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani says in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, anyone who says that Reuven sinned is mistaken. There's got the Hebrew poetry, literal rhyming. Kol ha'omer Reuven chata or choteh, eno ela toeh, is nothing but mistaken. As it says, the children of Yaakov were 12, right? Remember, the last part of that verse that describes Reuven lying with Bilhah ends with the children of Yaakov were 12. This teaches that they were all, equal or all part of a unit. And so certainly if he was part of that unit and he was not rejected, that implies that he must not have sinned so gravely, or they're all sort of equal standing. Elamani mekayem vayishkavet bilha pileg shaviv. So then how do I interpret the first part of that phrase, of that verse, which says that he slept with Bilha? It teaches shebilbel matzah o shalaviv. He messed up, confused his father's bed sheets, and the pasuk treats him as though he lay with her. In other words, whatever this thing is, and Rav Meidan is going to get into it, whatever this messing up the bed was described as laying with Bilha, even though that's not what he really did. How would that make sense? Again, we'll see. And a second passage, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says that righteous man, i.e. Ruvain, was saved from that sin, i.e. sleeping with Bilha, and it didn't actually happen. So then how do I understand the phrase, and he lay with Bilha, his father's concubine? Elbon imo tava. He was prosecuting or defending the insult to his mother. Somehow he was protecting Leah's pride or place, and that's what it means he lay with Bilha. Again, how is that interpreted literally? We'll see. In Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani's approach, Rashi also went in his interpretation to the Torah, as well as the Balei Tosfot and other commentaries, that it means he messed up the bed sheets, something like that. According to them, Ruvain was somehow, again, protecting his mother's insult, protecting his mother's pride, in that Yaakov had not placed his bed in the tent of Leah after the death of Rachel, but rather in the tent of Bilha. And Ruvain came and mixed up Bilha's sheets as though her bed, as though he lay with her. So somehow he moved her bed to Yaakov's tent or something like that. He got involved in Bilha's bed in attempting to moved it out of Yaakov's tent, right? The assumption that Yaakov somehow, again, I'm getting confused between Rav Meidan's story that we'll see later on and the Mefarshim he's quoting here themselves, right? So the idea is because Yaakov did not go to Leah's tent after the death of Rachel, Ruvain somehow tries to interfere or intervene in some way by getting involved with Bilha, messing up her sheets or something like that. Can we in fact divert so far from the plain sense of the text, which speaks in very clear words, just because of the sort of logic which dictates to us that Ruvain can't have sinned in this severe way? Not only that, let's kind of, I don't know how to inscribe what happened according to the Midrashim, which are accepted, and according to the way which is sort of usually learned, the way we usually learn the Parsha in the Beit Midrash, as follows. After the death of Rachel, Yaakov moves his bed to Bilha's tent, or moves Bilha's bed to his tent. Ruvain, who is jealous for the honor of his mother Leah, zealous for the honor of his mother Leah, in whose tent Yaakov has not placed his bed, comes and messes up her sheets, right? So again, just clarifying, the idea is after Rachel's death, Ruvain would have wanted Yaakov to then partner up or have his primary partner be Leah, but he doesn't. Instead, he turns to Bilha. And so Ruvain interferes with Bilha's bed in whatever way. He messes up the sheets, whatever he does, as we'll see in a moment. And that's his way of kind of protesting Yaakov's turn to Bilha instead of turn to Leah, Ruvain's mother. It's not clear what the nature of this bed confusion or messing up is, or bed sheet confusion or confusion or messing up is. From the Midrash, it seems like he overturned her bed. it's not clear what damage Ruvain caused in so doing. Was Bilhah in the bed? Did she fall and hurt herself? Was she embarrassed? Was Yaakov embarrassed by this and also sort of brought low in the sense that he then had to turn over the bed himself? From other Mefarshim, it sounds like Ruvain actually removed her bed. That is, he took Bilhah's bed out of the tent. We're still talking about, a marginal, peripheral damage, something which could immediately be repaired. Again, maybe the stain of the insult couldn't be immediately repaired, but whatever he physically did, you could just fix it. Again, this is the approach of the Midrashim that we're sort of trying to examine and see whether we can justify it, even though it's so far from the plain sense of, and he lay with Bilhah. In any event, there are two kind of areas which can teach a defense for Ruvain in this sin. Two sort of approaches to not justifying but defending his action. The first is that his intent was for good, and in some particular way he felt that the right was on his side when he was claiming, again, protesting the insult to his mother. The second would be that his sin didn't cause so much damage and there was something that could immediately be repaired, right? So if we're trying to sort of defend Ruvain, we can either say the action wasn't so bad, or we can say, even if the action was very bad, the intent was noble or justified. Certainly, this sin does not stand in any, relation to the sins that the book of Genesis deals with, from rebelling against God's literal word and eating from the tree of knowledge, the death of Hevel at the hands of Cain, and going all the way through to the sale of Yosef, right? So if we follow this midrashic approach, it certainly seems that it's a minimal sin. The great difficulty on this opinion that we've now been quoting and examining, this approach that Ruvain didn't sin, or that his sin was relatively small, is the fact that in the wake of his actions, he is deflected, pushed off from receiving the birthright and from receiving the kingship, the things that would normally go to the firstborn. As it says in Divrei Yamim 1, chapter 5, the sons of Ruvain, the firstborn of Israel, he was the firstborn, and in his chalelo yitzuei aviv, profaning his father's bed, his firstbornship was given to the sons of Yosef, the son of Yisrael, and the firstbornhood was no longer related to him. And Yehuda, who kind of rose to prominence amongst his brothers and to be a leader from amongst them, and the Bechorah went to Yosef, right? So Ruvain, implication is he's the firstborn, and that should come with an actual firstborn rights as well as a kind of leadership status. The firstborn rights go to Yosef, and the leadership status goes to Yehuda. So we're sort of stuck in this bind. The plain sense meaning doesn't seem to hold up, says Rav Meidan, because then we would expect Ruvain to be utterly dismissed from the family of Jacob, not even to have a share, nothing. But the defense and rereading of it winds up being so minimal that then it doesn't justify the punishment that he does receive. Again, we could always deflect some of those arguments, but that's why he sort of winds up looking for some kind of middle ground to explain what Ruvain actually did. Okay. Bilbel Yitzuei Aviv, confusing the sheets of his father. Al kanfei hadimayon, on the wings of the imagination. Let's return to our attempt to understand Ruvain's sin in confusing, mixing up his father's bed, based on the understanding that he didn't sleep with Bilhah. Two central questions stand in front of us. First, what did Ruvain actually do? What is the meaning of confusing the sheets? Ooh, hold on a second. Okay. Sure. Don't worry about that. Okay, let's go back to our attempt. So, yeah, two central questions stand in front of us. First, what did Reuven actually do? What's the meaning of confusing the bed? And also, how did Bilbul, confusing the bed, the assumption that Reuven overturned it or moved it to somewhere else, turn into Chilul, profaning the bed, which is what Yaakov critiques him for doing in Parashat Vayechi. And in Divrei Hayamim, as we saw, that the firstborn was handed off and the leadership was handed off because of Chalalo Yitzurei Aviv. So how does confusing turn into profaning? Second, how can we square this explanation of whatever this confusing the bed was with the plain sense of the words of the pasuk? Reuven went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. We're going to be helped a little bit using our imagination in order to try to describe what happened on that night. This is like a little fasten your seatbelts moment. Okay. After the death of Rachel, Yaakov invites Bilhah into his tent with the purpose of shifting her to the kind of lead of the house, or the possibility of having another child with her, the 13th child. We don't know why Yaakov didn't invite Leah, who was second in prominence after Rachel, to be his next primary wife. Was it because of her having been hated, quote unquote, as we discussed last week, on the meaning of hated? Was it last week? Yes. On the hated in quotes. Was it because of her being hated because of her deception on that first night of their marriage? Was it because Yaakov saw, in Bilhah, who was the maidservant of Rachel, something of the image and likeness or connection to Rachel who had died? Right. Remember, Bilhah was Rachel's maidservant, and so there was a connection to Rachel through her. Did he want to balance a little bit the number of children from Rachel and her family compared to those who had been born from Leah and her family? Right. Leah had so many more children coming from her, and so maybe turning to Bilhah and having another child would come closer to striking a little balance. Did he do this according to God's word or Ruach HaKodesh, some divine spirit intervention? Maybe he chose Bilhah because after the death of Rachel, she was the adoptive mother of his favored sons, Yosef and Binyamin, right? So maybe, again, coming back to last week also, the sort of tension between the direct relationship and the parenting relationship. Maybe it was because she was the primary parent to his favored children. So, moving her into his tent, was really about the children as opposed to the potential wives or spouses. Ein lanu esek benistarot. It's a funny thing for Abmedan to say. We have no business dealing with the hidden things. Okay, that's exactly what he is doing at some level. But I think he's differentiating between things we could never know, and we only have many possible ones, and we don't have any information to really resolve, as opposed to trying to square a pasuk which needs explanation, and therefore we're going to sort of deal with the hidden things. Only this is what we know. It was the right of Yaakov as a person, on his own right, and his duty as the head of the family, to choose his alone, to choose who he wanted in his personal tent. Nobody could, protest that claim. He was empowered to make that decision. Now it's nighttime in Yaakov's tent. Again, assuming that he's made this decision to take Bilhah into his tent. So now it's nighttime in Yaakov's tent. Yaakov is, missing for a little while to take care of his own affairs, and Bilhah is found in his tent, preparing herself for this wedding night, the night on which she's going to, transition from being a maidservant concubine to being Yaakov's wife, to being one of the matriarchs. And she's, just all excited about the glory which has fallen into her portion. In a few moments, Yaakov will arrive. It's dark outside. Everybody's sleeping. Nobody can see a thing. Reuven enters into the tent, kind of worked up and filled with anger about this maidservant who has displaced his mother from being the lead, matriarch, the wife of Yaakov. He takes Bilhah by force, drags her out, and prevents her, from shouting. He carries her off to some faraway tent, and there he ties her up and, blocks her mouth so that she can't cry for help. He does not sleep with her. God forbid he would defile himself with his father's concubine. He's doing this for a just cause, for the sake of his mother's honor. He also doesn't lie with her because he doesn't love her. The opposite is, in fact, correct. Bilhah, carried out against his mother, even if not, by her own initiative, right? Even if it was Yaakov's decision, the kind of action of a maidservant inheriting the place of her mistress, when she takes this primary place after the death of Rachel. Not only that, in addition, Reuven has no freedom, no free time to deal with Bilhah. From the time that he confines her in this faraway place, he hurries to his mother's tent. His mother, who presumably, at least partially is a partner to this secret action, and accompanies her, that's Leah, quickly and secretively to Yaakov's tent. Now it's even later at night. Yaakov comes into his tent after he has invited to that tent for the first time since Rachel's death, her substitute, replacement, Bilhah. The moon has already set, and the tent is in total, shrouded in total darkness. Yaakov, in the characteristic modesty that he was particular about always, does what he does in quiet, without words or without a whisper. And he has no way to discern, not by voice nor by sight, who is actually waiting for him. Vayiva boker v'hinei Leah, quoting from the beginning of quoting from last week's Parashah. He wakes up in the morning, and behold, it is Leah. I'm going to pause here and let you digest that while I do a bedtime check, and I'll be right back. Okay, here we go, continuing. Let us continue to sail on the wings of our imagination. Reuven has taken Bilhah by force from Yaakov's tent to somewhere, with her mouth, and I can't think, sometimes at this hour words elude me and I can't think of the right word for this, but her mouth is sealed, forcibly sealed.
Gagged. She's being
Gagged.
kidnapped. Yeah.
Yes, she is gagged. Thank you.
Having nothing to do with the Pshat of Vayishlach.
Right.
Whatever. Okay, go ahead.
Yep. Here we go. We had assumed that everybody was sleeping and no one could see, but it's not the case. In one of the tents, a young boy was trying to calm down his crying baby brother after their mother Rachel had died, and Bilhah, who was raising them, had left that night from the tent to Yaakov's tent without telling them where she was going. Yosef, the young boy, is not asleep. From the entrance of his tent, he sees with panic-stricken eyes Ruvain dragging Bilhah from her bed like sorry for these explicit words, like a rapist dragging the one he would rape. And he concludes from this what every one of us would have concluded from this horrible image. He also learns that night, that dreadful night, what kind of life awaits him without a mother to protect him, just like Bilhah doesn't have a mistress who would protect over her. The next morning, when the deception becomes known to Yaakov, Yosef tells him what he saw and all of his suspicions about Ruvain and his brothers, who were presumably, suspect of doing that kind of behavior. Now we get another one of the pegs in Rav Meidan's analysis here. This is the quote from the beginning of Parashat Vayeshev, Yosef 17. Vayave Yosef dibatam ra'a el avihem, right? He's hanging out with the Bnei Bilhah and Bnei Zilpah, and it says he brings an evil report, and it says, Kol ra'a shehaya ro'eh be'echav Bnei Leah haya magid la'aviv. Every bad thing he would see with his brothers, the sons of Leah, he would tell his father, and it lists a litany of them, including V'chashudim al ha'arayot, that they were suspect of sexually immoral behavior. So what's the basis, or what's the connection? What's this Rashi talking about? So Rav Meidan has now pulled it into this narrative. This is talking about Yosef, telling his father about his brother's behavior, including this particular story. It's possible that now we get to the literary read, which is sort of built off of all of this midrashic underpinning, and characteristically, it's not an obvious read. But if you take the story, then we need still a textual hook to get back to that Vayishkav. So how does he do it? It's possible that even that which it says in the verse, that Ruvain lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, is not a uvdat emet, a true fact, ela uvda hamishubedet linichtav behemshech pasuk. Rather, it's a fact which is subject to that which it says in the continuation of the pasuk. Vayishma Yisrael. Yaakov, Yisrael heard. In other words, Yaakov heard from Yosef that Ruvain lay with Bilhah. But the Torah itself is testifying. How does the pasuk conclude? Vayu v'nei Yaakov shnei masar. The sons of Yaakov were 12. No one of them was missing, because nobody actually did that heinous act, right? So just going again to the pasuk for a moment. When Yisrael was dwelling in that land, Ruvain went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and that's what Yaakov heard. But really, readers know that the children of Yaakov were 12. Ruvain was not excluded from that on account of this behavior, because this behavior was just what Yaakov heard, not what actually happened. Let's return to Yaakov's tent. When the dawn breaks, it becomes clear to Yaakov what this ruse was. Let's not even, expound all the words on the insult and pain that Yaakov feels, that this is the second time that he has been deceived in this way. And let's also not, expend all our words on the insult and pain of the one who was poised to shift from being a concubine to the legal wife and one of the matriarchs, Bilhah. The sin of Ruvain, even for those who think that he didn't actually sin with an actual sexual act, was grave and justified the punishment which was given to him for eternity. The fact that he was zealous for his mother's honor is not a sufficient defense, because Shimon and Levi also did what they did in Shechem, because they were jealous of their sister's honor, or zealous for their sister's honor. It's not a sufficient defense. The bet of Yaakov was not just confused, mixed up from one person to the other. It was also nitchalel, profane. Now he's coming to that question of how did the language shift from bilbel to nitchalel. This is the second time that Yaakov has come near a woman when his thought was, or assumption was of someone else. And this action has a sort of a serious profaning of the holy, as the Gemara says. And I will separate or kind of set apart from you those who rebel and those who sin against me. Rabbi Levi says, who are these people who are being kind of set aside and distanced? They are the B'nai Tesha Midot. This is Gemara Nadarim 20 that talks about people who are conceived in sexual relations that have non-ideal emotional or psychological circumstances or physical circumstances, and that those born of those the unions under those situations carry a weight, a blemish, a consequence, an echo of that. And here is the list, and amongst them are the offspring of rape. Again, we've all the critiques that we can offer here about why should the offspring be punished or suffer as a result. And again, there's a reading of this Gemara which is not saying they're being punished. It's just saying they are inevitably impacted by the circumstances because they'll carry through into the relationship. And it's also possible that the reading here is a sort of a more metaphysical one, that in sexual liaisons that are not consensual and loving, somehow it impacts the offspring. So children of rape, children of a relationship which carries hate, and children of timura, exchange. What does that mean? So the Ran comments there, children of exchange, where a person comes to, has sex with one of their wives thinking it's the co-wife, right? So when a child is born out of a sexual liaison where you confused or misidentified who the partner is, that again breeds literally some kind of confusion or difficulty in the offspring. So that's considered to be a profaning of the holiness of intimate sexual relations. And so the confusion of the bed is not just a mere confusion, but a real profaning that's now happens to Yaakov. And now he goes further with this. It seems that perhaps Yaakov stopped cohabiting with his wives at that point. He couldn't take Bilhah anymore, or he didn't take Bilhah anymore. And it seems like Leah neither, such that we find that the children of Yaakov were 12. Right now he's offering an additional reading of that phrase. Immediately after, Reuven slept with Bilhah, or so Yaakov thought, the children of Yaakov were 12, meaning the sort of the door is closed on Yaakov's childbearing, and by extension, the door was closed on Yaakov's sexual life, procreative life. There are commentaries who explain 12 and not 11, meaning Reuven didn't sin, right? That the implication of saying the children of Yaakov were 12 is Reuven, in spite of what happened above, was not excluded or banished. But we are now explaining 12 and not 13, meaning Yaakov did not have another child after his bed was profaned, meaning he no longer drew near to his wives. This was sort of like a breaking point and an end to that framework of relationship. If Yaakov had sex with Bilhah that night, she would have gotten pregnant with a 13th child. Leah did not get pregnant that night. Maybe when Yaakov revealed the deception, he prayed that she not become pregnant. He didn't want another child that would be a seed that was profaned from this child of an exchanged, substituted partner. He knew that a son like this, were it to be born, would be like Reuven, who was himself born from this profaned seed in a situation akin to, or that was a child of a substituted partnership, as Rav Meidan reminds us parenthetically, based on the midrashic understanding of the story. Ruvain was born from that first seed of Yaakov, meaning from Yaakov's sleeping with Leah on that marriage night, when Lavan deceived him and put her in place of Rachel. That's the rabbinic tradition and understanding. So Ruvain himself is such a child of that confused partnership. And in the events of Ruvain and Bilhah, Yaakov it becomes clear to Yaakov that this, seed from which Ruvain was born, the first of Yaakov's strength, was imperfect, and not fit for the sanctity of the firstbornship. Ruvain, in this one way, in this particular way, was like Lavan, his maternal grandfather, in the action of deception that he did on that night, in which Yaakov intended to marry Rachel for the 7 years of work. He could no longer be a firstborn to his father. Already in his youth, Ruvain, we can see in Ruvain a kind of zeal, protective instinct towards his mother, who was sort of frozen out in his, or kind of dismissed in his opinion, or from his perspective, from the tent of Yaakov. The story of the mandrakes that he found in the field and gave to Leah, his mother, leads in a roundabout way to the sort of forcing of Yaakov to leave Rachel's tent for a night and come to Leah's tent. That Ruvain did, from a completely pure heart. And he also wasn't the one who did that negotiation. He just brought the mandrakes to his mother, and then she had that negotiation with Rachel. And he can't be caught or accused really of sin in that area. But now this sort of blemish reveals itself retroactively. Again, this is a strong, very reading, but okay, making the connection to that story, which it's recorded in the text, and we saw it last week just in the context of the back and forth fight between Rachel and Leah, and now Rav Meidan is reading into it sort of the already evident sense of Ruvain's defense of Leah, meaning it's not, last week the way we read it is incidental that Ruvain found these mandrakes, brought them home, he didn't even know what they were, and and Leah and Rachel have their negotiation about it. Now Rav Meidan seems to want to read it almost more, that he is going out and getting them and bringing them to Leah, in an attempt to promote her position amongst the wives. The 12 tribes of Israel are now kind of sealed, and the a congregation of nations that was promised to Yaakov will come forth from his son Yosef. Meaning Ruvain's dismissal is complete with Yaakov seeing this instinct of Ruvain's. It's sort of he's no longer fit to be the Bechor. Yaakov A, has no more children, and B, kind of gets a full sense of who Ruvain is and this deceptive nature, and shifts the firstbornship. Okay, here comes the close. And I read over and over the first line of this paragraph, and I'm still not sure. It still seems to say the opposite of what I would have expected it to say. So for the Hebrew readers here, if you're able to piece this together with the rest of the upcoming paragraph, let me know. Okay, conclusion. The great disappointment from Ruvain stems from the assumption that Yaakov did not suspect Ruvain of defiling Bilhah. But above, we raised the possibility, or we offered the explanation, that the pasuk which explains that Ruvain lay with Bilhah isn't describing what actually happened. It's what Yosef told his father Yaakov, Yisrael. And according to this, we can then assume that Yaakov's initial reaction was, much, much angrier than it needed to be, right? If Yaakov was just reacting to the deception, that would be one thing. Woke up that morning and saw Bilhah was there, and saw Leah was there and not Bilhah. That would be one level of reaction. But when Yosef comes and tells him what he saw Reuven doing, then his reaction is infinitely harsher, because now there is this clearly recognizable facts, which would be grounds, which would provide a significant grounds for suspicion that Reuven really did sleep with Bilhah, and that this is not just tale-bearing. When Reuven's disgrace about the way he behaved is revealed, according to our about the way he behaved with Bilhah, according to our approximation or imagination of it, meaning when the story got out that Yosef saw Reuven taking Bilhah away, nobody with any reasonable reason would believe that he didn't sleep with her, right? Even Bilhah's testimony that she hadn't been defiled would not even necessarily be believable. So then at what stage did the transition happen between Vayishma Yisrael, that's what Yaakov heard happened. Again, we're all in the framework that he didn't actually sleep with her. We're following Rav Meidan's imaginative story. Didn't actually sleep with her. That's just what Yaakov was told. And Yaakov, has the kind of harsh reaction that he does. When does the transition happen between, and Yaakov heard this story, and Vayu b'nei Yaakov shnei masar, the sort of preservation of the integrity of the family, that is to say, the decision not to reject Reuven out of hand. In other words, when does Yaakov realize or kind of recognize, accept that Reuven should remain a part of his children and not be, pushed off into the abyss as a result of this immorality with Bilhah? Presumably, the Torah's testimony that the children of Yaakov were all ksherim is not theoretical, right? It reflects that at some point Yaakov comes to accept this, or the Torah wants us to accept it as true. The possibility that Reuven was suspected for a severe act incorrectly, and that the Torah needs to testify that he didn't actually sin, is also familiar to us, specifically about Reuven, from the sale of Yosef. Reuven's advice to the brothers to throw Yosef alive into the pit in the wilderness sounds cruel, and no less cruel than the previous advice of the brothers to kill him with their hands and throw his body into the pit. The kind of law that we have about certain heretics and others, moridin ve'in ma'alin, we lower them into a pit and we don't take them out of a pit, is very similar to a death sentence, right? So when Reuven is saying throw him alive into the pit, how different is it really than saying kill him? And it sounds incredibly cruel. And when the brothers then listen to Yehuda, who is saying to take him out of the pit and sell him, they are, in so doing, walking back from their agreement to Reuven's cruel suggestion, because, as Yehuda says, what benefit, what gain to killing our brothers and covering up his blood? Good pit stop, Bracha. Thank you. Reuven's right. So again, Rav Meidan is sort of setting up for us the first blush reading of the story, in which Reuven is as cruel as the other brothers, and Yehuda is the one who is showing compassion. Reuven is the only one who was not part of this mercy plan of the brothers to take Yosef out of the pit and sell him, and he remains then, practically speaking, the cruel one from amongst the brothers. But the Torah testifies about him that he was actually the most compassionate and ethical of all of them, because his intent was, this is all going from the sale of Yosef in the beginning of next week's Parashah Vayishlach, his intent was Laman hatzilo tomi adam lahashivo el aviv. His intent was in saying to throw him into the pit that he would save him from their hands and bring him back to his father. Right, that after eventually they would all go away, he would come back and take him out of the pit and bring him home. But the brothers didn't know that at the time, that was his plan. That's only what the Torah tells us his intentions, right? So Rav Meidan is sort of setting up the same kind of thing. You have what it appears to be on the face of it and the story that everyone understands, and the Torah is letting us into what the actual intentions are. Did Reuven's brothers recognize this intention of his? From Reuven's criticism of the brothers when they stand in front of Yosef to seek food much later on, when they go down to Egypt in the famine, and now they come to Yosef not knowing it's him, just thinking they're standing in front of the viceroy of Egypt and trying to get food. It seems like yes. It seems that, or makes sense that when Reuven went back to the pit and tore his clothes, and then went to the brothers and said, the boy is not there, and now what am I going to do? The brothers understood that his intent actually had been in order to save him from their hands and take him back to his father, right? So they already by that point then know what his actual intentions were. And it's possible that his sort of noble intentions in that whole story having to do with Yosef, who had brought an evil report in front of his father about the whole story of Bilhah, which led to Reuven's excommunication or rejection from his position vis-a-vis his father and his brothers. That's what brought to the kind of trusting Reuven's version of the story in the events with Bilhah, that he didn't actually sleep with her, and that even with as harsh as the behavior was, his intention was for good. We'll bring a example or an analog to this kind of situation from a story in the end of Tractate Nedarim. An adulterer comes into the house of a woman, and then suddenly her husband comes in. The adulterer, slips away and hides out somewhere near a pile of vegetables, and a snake slithers in to where the vegetables are and deposits its venom, its poison, in the vegetables. Right, bites in and deposits poison into the vegetables. Now the husband comes along. We don't know exactly the timeline here. The husband comes along and wants to taste the vegetables, and the adulterer says to him, "Don't eat these vegetables. The snake, a snake, tasted them. Snake bit them, and therefore they could be poisoned." Rava says about this story, the woman is permissible, because if the man had actually carried through his adultery with her, then he would have been just as happy for the husband to eat the vegetables and die. As it says, they have performed adultery, and therefore blood is on their hands. Right now, Rav Meidan just explains the story for a moment and says it wasn't clear whether, from the data that we have, the story was presented in front of the sages and they're trying to analyze it. It's not clear if the woman actually, went through with the adultery together with the adulterer, and therefore she's prohibited to her husband, because the halacha, the black letter, obviously lots and lots of context and circumstances, but the simple halacha is that the woman is prohibited to her husband after adultery. So we don't know whether in this situation the adultery happened and therefore the woman is prohibited to her husband, or maybe the adultery hadn't, been come to fruition yet, in which case she's permitted to her husband. Rava's claim is that if the adulterer had actually carried out the sin, then for sure he would have preferred that the woman's husband die from the snake's poison. The fact that he chooses to save the husband shows that he has a clear conscience, relatively speaking, of course. And the saving of the life kind of shows retroactively that he is free of the suspicion of adultery. Even though we can certainly distinguish between these cases, maybe there is a similarity between them. The brothers, thought that if Yosef figured that if Yosef had uncovered the true humiliation and degradation of Ruvain, then Ruvain would never have done something to actually save Yosef. The relatively clean conscience of Ruvain was what led him to actually be willing to try to save Yosef and bring him back to his father. So that's sort of the that moment is what helps us see that both the Torah's validate both the Torah's testimony and the brothers' understanding. How does it happen for Yaakov? Rav Meidan doesn't kind of circle back explicitly and spell out for us that Yosef, that Ruvain rather didn't actually sleep with Bilhah. So there's a lot here, but if I could try to summarize it, it seems like, again, Rav Meidan is struggling between, as he looks at the text, the plain sense of, and he lay with Bilhah, the fact that if it were such, these are again his assumptions, if it were such a, if that sin literally took place, Ruvain not just should have been deposed from the birthright, he should have been dismissed from the brotherhood and from the 12 tribes. That's just a bridge too far. And so it's difficult to accept the plain sense of the text. On the other hand, the rescue of Ruvain that the sages go through and their attempt to suggest that all he did was move a bed, overturn a bed, doesn't justify the deposing of him from the birthright and the leadership position. And so there's got to be something in the middle. It has to be a severe enough sin, but it can't be the literal sin. Along with that, we have all the other kind of supporting, evidence of, trying to imagine what was really going on for Yaakov at this moment. We have a series of reasons why he might have turned to Bilhah as his partner instead of Leah next. We have the sense that Yosef, was speaking ill of Bnei Leah in particular. And then we have Rav Meidan's imagination. And what comes out of all of that is this story in which Ruvain, sins gravely by forcibly removing Bilhah and putting Leah in her place. Yosef sees him carrying Bilhah away and is assuming that this is an act of rape. Again, what's much less clear to me is what would be the motivation. I mean, again, he more sort of takes it as that was never Ruvain's intention, but what else could anybody assume based on what they were seeing? But I think we could already assume maybe he was just trying to remove her and put Leah in her place. But for Rav Meidan, again, at the freeze frame moment that Yosef sees it, he has no reason to assume anything other than Ruvain is carrying Bilhah away to, again, maybe it's just he gets carried away somehow from his anger. He tells that to Yaakov. That's then the textual interpretation of, she lay, that Yaakov heard. Again, it's a very non-literal, but it's a, who knows, possible. Yaakov heard that Ruvain had lay with Bilhah, not that Ruvain had actually lay with Bilhah. Yaakov heard. And so this is the story that Yaakov is carrying around. And only at the sale of Yosef to the brothers then kind of see that must not be the case. And somehow that makes its way back to Yaakov also. And so he expresses his disappointment, but doesn't utterly reject Ruvain. We're missing anything else? And that's sort of the kind of the flow of the story. And along the way, we also have these other little snippets of kind of what was Yosef and Binyamin's life like at that moment, and what was, what were sort of the brothers contending with in the wake of Rachel's death. What was Bilhah's place? What was Leah's place? Yes, and then that last piece about the last phrase, the children of Yaakov were 12, that this sort of was like a crushing moment for Yaakov and kind of led to both the removal of Ruvain from leadership and also the kind of like cessation of relations for Yaakov with his wives, because he was just had been burned again, and sort of couldn't go back to that place. I'm going to step away for one moment, and then feel free to go if you need to go, but happy to come back in a moment and entertain any questions or discussion. I'll be right back. Thoughts or questions?
I'm trying to figure out why. I can get that he had a fanciful day and he wrote this up, but why he put it in the book, I do not get. It's completely, obviously not according to the Pshat, including Ki alita mishkaveh avicha az chilalta is confirmation of the Pshat that, so the fanciful rape, not rape, is really hard to take.
So Sally, I'm gonna stay on this for one moment, if you will. So, and any thought on Rav Meidan's why he doesn't accept the, his main contention about why you can't take it literally is if Reuven really did that, how could he have remained one of the tribes? And so, what would we say to that? Just okay, because everybody makes mistakes, or you can, the promise was that all of Yaakov's descendants would inherit, and some of them did horrific, heinous things, and that doesn't mean that you get excluded.
I just think this is just going up to the top of the list of stories that where somebody needs to defend the boy's behavior, and it's indefensible.
Reuven's behavior.
Yeah.
Yes. No, I totally agree. But it's the, yeah. So, I mean, I think the question Rav Meidan is asking is, if you take it at its literal sense, how does he not get a more severe punishment? That's, I think, the question he's still asking.
I don't think that digging up a justification is a way of explaining why he didn't get a punishment.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Accepted. David?
Why don't Shimon and Levi get a more severe punishment?
Right. So what he says about that here is just, he thinks they did get a more severe punishment than Reuven in sort of being, and he calls it an avon chamur, and he does say, I'm trying to remember if he says it in the other essay, the language with them is, their names are not going to be part of my lineage, but they still get a portion. So, we could ask the question too, given that they did what they did and they were still included, we shouldn't be surprised that Reuven could do what the plain sense and still be included.
Right. Or just to say what you said before, everybody's got their portion, and you do bad things, you're still part of the family.
Yeah.
But the other question, I mean, this is just such an extraordinary text, and really, it would be great to write to Rav Meidan and ask how he feels about this text today. How many times does he want to say that Reuven's intentions were good? I mean, it certainly feels like he's defending. He's a good boy. Or is it the end justifies the means? I don't think so. But it's a crazy text.
Yeah. What I appreciate that I was sort of in the weeds with it, and what I appreciate that you're saying as you take a step back and sit with it is just, I think at two levels. One, why do we have to justify his behavior, an apologetic, like just to let the text stand as it does, and and let Yaakov be remarkably tolerant, or punished him, but is not going to dismiss his child from the family. And then this sort of second is like the fact that the need to defend drives him to such a just terrible tale. What's gained? And again, at some level, he may say, well, I'm trying to figure out the shot, but at what cost, maybe, of adding this terrible story to the canon. Again, we could ask that question about Chazal as well. They added lots of terrible stories in Midrashim, but maybe we don't have to follow that model. So presenting, coming back to Sally's question, like, why put this in front of readers, stands.
And if you want to get into the weeds, so first of all, isn't kidnapping equivalent to murder?
Right.
So what do you
Yeah.
want to do with that? And secondly, we learn that sons are supposed to go to great lengths in order not to fantasize about their father's sexuality.
Right.
Right. We learn in Pesachim that you can't even go to the public baths with your father.
Right. Right.
And so here he totally shines a spotlight on the private life of his father in front of the entire family. And then the other piece, which I don't think I underlined, was, he was the father of the family, and so he has a right to choose.
Yeah.
Oh, it's on page 317. הייתה זו זכותו כאדם וחובתו כאבי המשפחה לבחור לו לבד את אוהלו לפרטי. Is that right? That he's not supposed to take into consideration anybody else? This is I wish we had a master class with Rav Meidan and ask him about this one, because this is a real head scratcher.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Well, I hope I didn't not make a mistake, but I maybe this was not the right one to choose because it's just too upsetting to learn. And thank you for sharing honest feedback about it. I really do appreciate that. And I don't know. It's I wonder what Rav Meidan would say. I mean, again, we're seeing the different dimensions of him and his thought, and sometimes it leads to a place that's makes us uncomfortable and upset. That's absolutely legitimate.
But I would imagine it's also cautioning us about what you say about people and to people. And that in itself also has been equated with killing someone.
And when you say that, which are you referring to a particular part about what you say to or about someone? A part of the
in other words, well, partly what you say and also what the other person hears and accepts. So there's a responsibility on both sides.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Thanks for going over time for this difficult one. And,
don't worry about it. We can take it.
Yes, you can. Love to mom and dad and to all. Good night.